smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity. And make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste, the therapist. Let's go.
Hi, beautiful people. So if you've never been into my podcast before, my name is Celeste. I'm a therapist from Boston. And what I do is I come on, I talk to people who are doing things to empower the lives of others by sharing their story. And the goal behind everything that I do is to just help shift the way people think. I don't typically come on at 5. So for people that are catching me now, you caught me at a good time. So we're on a little bit earlier today because I'm just like really excited to speak to my special guest. And so for people that are watching me on video for the first time, this is an audio podcast. So you can always catch the podcast. There are currently 292 episodes. So if you ever find yourself feeling stuck, there's an outlet with the podcast that can help you kind of shift up your thinking a little bit. The goal in what I do is not to tell you how to think. This is live. The goal is not to tell you how to think, but to help you kind of get unstuck by maybe thinking about things in a little bit of a different way. So I'm going to bring on my special guest. We're currently streaming on Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube. I'm going to add him to the stream. Hi, how are you?
Celeste, I am fantastic. I know you're about to jump into this. I just got to brag on you for a minute.
What are you doing? You can't do that backstage.
I told you backstage that I've been listening to your podcast and I wanted to get familiar with you before going on, but then I couldn't stop listening. I was so interested and every word you said like gold. But I went on your podcast. It's got 126 ratings. Y'all, if you heard the podcast, leave a rating, leave a review for her. That's going to help her out. And let me read this review on the iTunes, on the podcast here, on the Apple podcast.
You could have told me backstage.
It says, you know what? I don't do good with compliments and encouragement, and I'm learning to receive that and be grateful.
Okay.
And so this is like a two-way street, a two-way exercise, receiving encouragement. That's the therapeutic work we are doing right now. This review says simply amazing. And then it says, I have been educated, enlightened, engaged, and raptured with every episode I've listened to. Celeste is thoughtful, knowledgeable, and shows such care and compassion. I believe that. You can tell that she's an excellent therapist. You can tell. Thank you for your work, and I hope you have much more in store to bless your audience with, just like this episode. And then another one says, soul-fed, absolutely love Celeste. Every episode has been valuable for me. I second that notion. And then just this last review, and I promise I'm going to stop embarrassing you. This one, it says 5 stars, and it's just a bunch of fire emojis. That's it. That's the whole review. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fires. And I'll give you 7. 7.
June,
all right, that's it.
I'm gonna get you back.
That's it. I'm done with my whole bit. No, for real. I had to brag on you a little bit at the start of the show. I agree with all these reviews.
I appreciate it so much.
And whoever did this 2-star review, I'm gonna pray for you. And you need that prayer. I don't know what's going on in your life. You know, you might be the kind of person that needs this podcast. Anyway, I'm gonna stop.
So I really like you a lot. You made me laugh like crazy and I haven't even started. Okay, so June is actually a chaplain.
How do we segue into that? It's real serious work that I do. You went from fire emojis to working at the hospital. Yep. That works.
Gosh. Oh, this is going to be fun editing. I get to listen to this again. So June, J.S. Park, as he goes by, is a chaplain in Florida. And he has been dealing with a lot of grief and working with people around that. The way I was introduced to him, a man by the name of Crispin, who was on my show.
Crispin.
Yes, shout out to you, Chris, when he listens to the podcast. And I listened to his podcast, and you were on his podcast talking about what you did. And I was so inspired by it. And I went and I found the book called The Voices We Carry. So I want to talk about the book. I also want to talk a little bit about the violence that's taking place in the Asian American community. But before I get in, one of the things I like to do is give my guests a little bit of background give my audience members a little bit of background on my guest. So tell people a little bit about where you grew up at and what was your upbringing like.
For sure. Yeah. I had sort of a hybrid upbringing. And so I grew up in a very quote unquote Asian/Eastern home. I grew up here in Florida in the States. So then I also grew up in a westernized upbringing because I went to, an American school and grew up in America. And so I was kind of having a foot in both worlds and decided early on that I was an atheist. My parents tried to get me to go to church and I didn't like any of it. They sent me to a Korean church, and a lot of that religious institution of the Korean church, they mix a lot of the kind of guilt trip shame culture of the traditional, the bad parts of that culture. And then you take the evangelical culture, the bad parts of that. If you mix that, you get a bad cocktail. Mm-hmm. So even very young, when my parents forced me to go, didn't want to do anything with that. So decided very early I was an atheist. And then my parents, when I turned around 12, they started arguing and fighting all the time because we grew up pretty poor. And I know that there are different levels of poor. It's relatively poor, not as bad as some, but certainly we didn't have all the resources we needed. Mm-hmm. And right around when I turned 12, my parents' businesses started taking off. My dad ran a dojo. My mom had a laundromat and kind of like a fruit/grocery store, mm-hmm. kind of typical of maybe some Asian immigrants to the US. But then when at 12, they started fighting about money all the time. There was cheating, and then they abused each other.
And then you were the only child, right?
I had one younger brother.
Okay.
And so he also suffered a lot of that trauma, but I think I took the brunt of it. Mm-hmm. And so at 12 to 14, for 2 years, my parents fought all the time. They would punch each other. They would throw lamps. One time, my mom, she cut my dad's forearm from wrist to elbow. I think I put that in the book. It was just, the police were called from the neighbors. It got real bad. And then at 14, on my 14th birthday, actually, was the final day of their marriage. And probably like some of the guests you spoke to, I listened to, I think it's Brett Cotter. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How he was saying at 6, how his parents' divorce deeply affected him. That is sometimes we say like, oh, divorce, like it's a very casual thing. I know that when some parents make that decision, it's the right decision for them, mm-hmm. for sure. So I don't mean to at all denigrate anyone who's been through divorce. But certainly in my own family, that was a fracture point. That was like when, before and after, Mm-hmm. And so for me, that trauma, I just absorbed all that in my body. I started drinking. I didn't stop for maybe the next 10 years. This is an embarrassing part of my story. I don't tell that much, but around that time when I was 14, I started going to the strip club almost every weekend.
In Florida, where were you living at during that time?
That was in Tampa, Florida. So if you know about that area, the human trafficking there and the strip clubs and all of that, it's kind of enmeshed. But there's a whole, I guess, infamous set of strip clubs down in South Tampa.
Okay.
And so that's where I would go all the time. When I turned 18, I stopped going. I guess because it wasn't rebellious anymore. So that's a little weird thing that I might have to figure out in therapy. But yeah, it was just, everything was tumultuous, upside down. Nothing made sense. Nothing was familiar. My dad remarried very quickly to a very abusive woman, and then her son moved into our place, and it was just all confusing and chaotic. And I think what really helped was I started going to a church, though I was not at all spiritual or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But they invited me because I could play the drums. Mm-hmm. And right around the end of high school and in college, I was playing for them. And the preacher, he was a Korean pastor. He couldn't speak English that well. And his sermons were okay, but they weren't the best. But he was such a loving person. And this church was so loving. And it was such a supernatural love that I couldn't wrap my mind and my heart around it. And then I had to extrapolate back, like, where are they getting this supernatural, impossible love from? You know, and I know that there are probably psychological, scientific answers for all of that. But for me, there was some spiritual basis for the love that they had. And so that's when I started to understand this is grace. You know, this is the love of, when they talk about the love of Christ, that's what this is. And so I was probably in my mid 20s or even later 20s when I started. There was no epiphany, no overnight sudden like light bulb. It was just a gradual awakening into this faith stuff. It's real. Like, oh my gosh, for me, it's real. So then became a youth pastor. And then at that first church that I was at, I actually ended up taking the job of that Korean pastor. He moved on and I filled his place. He actually ended up officiating the wedding for me and my wife. So we're still in touch with him.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Aren't there momentous figures in our lives who they just speak life into us and set us on a different path? Whether it's one word, one sermon you hear from them, or just the way that they're a constant presence in your life. He was one of those people.
Wow.
You know, just a life changer, all of it. So, but at that church, when I became a pastor there, I didn't grow up in church, so I didn't understand the intricacies and the politics and the way to do things. And I have, I think Koreans have a word for it. I'm sunjinhae, which means I'm kind of naive or gullible. That's sort of what that means. So I just sort of believe what everybody says. And I believe people at face value. I just assume the best of everybody. And that's a good thing, but that can also get you in trouble, right? So at that church, I suffered so many wounds, and I lasted about 5 years, and it ended really badly. They let me go. I tried to quit maybe 2 years before that, and they wouldn't let me. But then I don't want to make it a long story, but basically it ended really, really badly. I was so wounded. I would have stayed at that church forever. But I left, and I thought I was done with church. Almost went to another ministry. They wounded me, probably worse. And then I ended up finding another church, and I was there for about 2 years. I loved it, and we're still on good terms. But at some point in the second year, I was like, I don't know if pastoral ministry is for me. And so then I left that job, or I should say that pastoral role, 4 months before I got married. And so when I got married, I was essentially jobless. I was just doing guest preaching stuff, but I didn't have a full-time job. And of course, you know, in my culture, if you're jobless and you're getting married, that's no good from anybody. All the parents were looking at me at the aisle like, you better figure something out right now. You know, you got a plan for my, you know. So and understandably so. And then the first year of marriage, thank God for my wife. I don't think we always talk about the reality of when you go after your dream or you pursue your passion, there are quote unquote sponsors or people who help. And sometimes we make it look like we're self-made, or, oh, I just worked really hard on this book and it popped out. But there are people who have our backs, who are our cheerleaders, and who financially can. So there's a lot of, there's layers of privilege there. There's layers of people helping us out. Nobody's a self-made person. And so if it wasn't for my wife, there's no way I would have been a chaplain. No way I would have written the book that I did. But ended up getting into this chaplain internship. Didn't know what I would think. On my first day working on the hospital floor, I saw a man die right in front of me. It was my first day of working. I was an intern. And so we had to go break the news to the family. And that's part of what a chaplain does. We accompany the doctor to do that. And the doctor breaks the news. They say what happened. And usually they exit, but the chaplain stays. And so we kind of pick up the pieces / stay in the aftermath. And I was there to offer counsel. And I knew it was so scary to see the deepest, most sheer agony a person can go through. And I knew I belonged in that room.
Really?
I was like, this is where I'm called to be. You know, there are very few moments in life where we feel like, this is where I have belonging. This is what I'm made for. All my experiences up until now led me to this, you know? So I knew. And then finished the internship, got into the residency. I think they accept like 5 a year. And that sounds like a brag. I'm sorry. But
No, don't be sorry. That's good. Brag. You got in.
yeah, I was so excited. And you read the book, so you know that the interview is really weird for chaplains. They ask you all these emotional questions and they ask you about your upbringing, and they're trying to poke you a little bit because they're trying to see how much work have you done on yourself. It's not a typical job interview. It's not like, oh, when you worked at this company and your output was this and your KPIs, it's none of that. It's like, hey, so how did you handle, when your parents divorced at 14? It was painful, right? And I'm like,
why are you in my business?
Yeah, I was like, that's personal. At least take me out for coffee first or something. But they ask all these personal questions. They want to see how, where sort of your emotional radar is and all of that, your temperature and everything. And then the residency, likewise, was just as tough. And yeah, I have been a chaplain now for almost 6 years. I work part-time at that hospital where I got the training, and now full-time at a nonprofit for the homeless. Mm-hmm. And it's been hard, but I have to say, I absolutely, absolutely love it. Absolutely love it.
Sharing that. And, in his book, The Voices We Carry, he goes through a lot of his childhood story. The pain and thinking about all of the things that you went through and your, working as a chaplain and being married. He goes through all of that. But one of the things that comes up a lot for not just him and for all of us are these voices. We have like these external and internal voices that most of us are not aware of unless we sit down and talk to someone and we start to challenge it or pay attention to what's happening. We don't understand that we may be being governed by some kind of trauma lens, right? So one of the things that I want to share with my audience is these voices. So in the book, it says J.S. draws from his experience as a hospital chaplain to present the voices model. This model explores the 4 internal voices. So the self-doubt, pride, people-pleasing, and judgment. So let's talk about those 4 internal voices, the self-doubt one. Let's start with that one.
Yeah. Oh, man. Celeste, so real quick story. When the book first came out last year, I did a series of radio interviews. Again, that's a brag. I'm sorry.
Can you stop?
Do you see the self-deprecation coming out? I can't help it. I
know.
Oh, man. Yeah. So went on a bunch of a series of radio interviews because I'm awesome. No. So one of them, he asked me about self-doubt. And I said, hey, that voice, like when you're presenting or you're hosting on a radio show, and then there's this other voice that kind of goes, well, that was dumb. Why'd you say it like that? That was weird, that noise you made just now, or that face. Or like, hey, you're live right now. You're live, right? You can't go back. You can't edit. And I told the radio host that, and there was about 4 seconds of radio silence when I asked him, what that voice is like? And he was like, oh, yeah. It's like, oh, okay. And then he kind of went, okay, we're going to take a commercial break real quick. And in the commercial break, he was telling me like, oh man, I kind of lost myself there because I knew exactly what you were talking about. Right? Because there's that voice that says not good enough, that says you could have done better. What was that? Are you for real right now? Like there's that voice, right? And what I found out about that voice, and I know I'm giving away the book a little bit, but the reason that voice exists is I purport based off of Karen Horney's theory on neurosis and human growth and a bunch of other resources. But what I got from her is that we each have this idealized self. So the person that we want to be. And there's a gap between where we are and the person that we would like to be. And the life struggle is that we never quite close that gap, right? Or the goalpost always changes. We see this idealized person, like he's the one who can walk into a room, strike up a conversation, everybody loves him. She's the one who can walk in with all the credentials, looking fly, no sweat, everything, just walking in perfect, effortless. We all have this person that we want to be. And Karen Horney goes through these different types. There's like the warrior, there's like the eloquent speaker, there's like the sage monk. How calm can I be? And so we all have this idea, this picture of who we want to be. And because we're running up this edge of this cliff called perfection or idealism, that's when the doubts come in. And I think my theory was that when the doubts come in, it's almost a self-protection mechanism because we're so afraid of failure. Like, hey, don't do that. That's too dangerous. That's not safe, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So what I had to learn to ease or mitigate or to navigate, to negotiate with my voice of self-doubt is to have a funeral for my idealized self.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to say, I don't think I'll ever be that person.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I know that the popular, I guess, self-help / therapeutic thing to say is you are enough. And I believe that. I agree with that. I can't knock on that at all.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times in life when I am not enough due to some kind of worldly goal that I couldn't meet, some kind of standard that I couldn't keep, something about this image that I could not meet. And sometimes it just wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to learn that that was fine,
Mm-hmm.
that was okay. You know, that when I did that presentation, it bombed. It wasn't that good. And that's okay.
Like
and
in the book, when you spoke and he was like, that wasn't good. And your wife told you the same thing.
Oh yeah. So I think that's in chapter 6 where I gave this sermon at a church and I knew from the first 10 seconds, you ever know when you know it's not going to go well? You feel it, the terror and the sweat and then your back gets hot and then your head's like, you start feeling swimmy. And then as you're talking, you're like, it's a tough crowd. They didn't laugh at that joke, you know, and they're just looking at me, you know, and you start having this like almost trialogue where it's like, you're talking to them and then you're trying to remember what you're saying. And then there's the other voices like, oh, they're not with you right now. Say something, you got to make this right. And then, so that was that day. And I sat down and what I did was I opened my notepad. I actually did this. I took out my pen and I wrote down where it went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wrote down what I could have done better. So I kind of balanced myself out. I took a good analytical look at myself.
Yeah.
And then when I drove home with my wife that day, my wife turns to me in the car and I put this in the book, but she said, well, that wasn't very good.
Yeah. And I think that we don't, you know, this ideal self and since, you know, speaking, I think that we're not always going to get it right on the first try.
That's right.
You know? And I think, you know, social media, there's this facade that look at them or look at what they're doing, but that person's doing the same thing with somebody else, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So if we can, you know, that was a perfect example on like, we're not going to always get it right, but then we can look and learn from when we didn't get it right and look at it that way.
Absolutely. And you know what? Just to finish that story, because I made my wife sound really mean, but she did say, you know, she said that wasn't very good, but she said, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, she did.
And so, you know, when we fail, and sometimes we do fail, that's an event, right? That's not us. And like you said, I mean, we can try again. There's going to be other opportunities, you know, and sometimes it's the growing pains of failure that get us to the place where we want to go. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be this perfect place. Mm-mm. And we can find contentment in that.
Yeah, that's why when she said, but you're good, that's what was the turning point for you. You know, that when she said that like really helped a lot. And you're like, I am good, you know? So that was awesome. So the next voice that you brought up was the pride. What's that about for people that are struggling with that? Yeah.
So in particular, I call that the voice of self-exaltation. And every time in our chaplain training, we had a group of 4 or 5 people, both in the internship and the residency. We would dig deep into ourselves and then we would offer each other feedback face to face. And so that was an incredibly difficult part of the chaplaincy because we're not used to having direct feedback from strangers tell us honestly about ourselves. And we would be reading it from something we typed up the night before. And some of the feedback, people are like, okay, I can get with that, I get with that. But then you'd hear something that you could tell, and I say this for me too, I'd never heard something like that before. Nobody was that direct with me about it. And so most of the chaplains were receptive, as difficult as that was, but we would always have at least one person in the program at a time, whether, you know, it was the internship or residency, they wouldn't hear feedback from anybody. A wall would just come up they'd get defensive, they would get real angry and bitter, not, angry, not in a good way, not a healthy kind of anger. And they would say, well, and then rationalize, and all these defense mechanisms. And even now you see within the church, you see within political circles, it's hard to receive that kind of feedback and criticism and then come to self-awareness and then know, like, hey, that thing that I did or said, that wasn't okay, or there's a better way to do it than that, or the people that I'm with, the group that I'm hanging out with, looking left and right, is a big yikes. I need to have some self-awareness. But what I come to find out, and this is true of all the voices, there's if you chase it all the way down, there's a reason why they exist, is because we didn't have a safe place to be criticized. And therefore the walls come up in order to protect ourselves, because it threatens the idea of the selves that we built, right? And so that's why we get defensive, is because we didn't have a place where somebody could safely offer feedback, not as an indictment of that person's value, but a feedback as a direction for that person to grow. Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah. And that's, man, I'll tell you, that's still hard, right? It's still hard to hear feedback. It's still hard to receive advice. And a lot, if it's unsolicited, or if it's from online, that doesn't always count. But from our spouses, from family members, from people that we work with, our colleagues, when they come to us, it's hard to hear, even when they say it perfectly, as gently as they can, and every word is right. There's still something in us that wants to push back. There's that thing that just comes up, as that internal attorney, I heard somebody say.
I struggled with that in my relationship, of hearing the way that I was, how I would like snap back if he would correct something. And then I had a hard time hearing it. But then I said, you know what, this is what he's hearing. I need to listen and understand. And I feel like that's how I've been able to grow. And there are times where I get feedback like that, and internally I can feel my defense come up. But then I challenge it. Like, I pay attention to it. I don't allow it to dictate my behavior, so it's not, I think that even though those voices are there, it's not that we have to act on it or not act on it, but it's important to pay attention to it.
That is 100% right. And what I noticed for me is, and I think this may be true of anybody, if anybody's going to enter into that stream of feedback, the initial reaction is always going to be tough. There's going to be emotions that pop up. They may say things in a way that triggers and provokes very strong reactions. But if you can get through that initial awkward weirdness of it, maybe you won't talk to that person for the next 2 weeks because it's just so awkward, right? But then you think of even just a seed of what they said, a little bit of that kernel, then you can, you pay attention to that part, right? And then you can say, you know what? Okay, 98% of what they said, I don't know. But that 2%, I do that.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
So the next voice is people pleasing. And this is something that you talked about a lot, that you struggled with.
Oh, man. Celeste, so this is both personal for me and it's cultural, right?
Oh, okay.
Because I think that's chapter 4, I believe. I kind of sew in some themes of my own culture. And, part of growing up Korean, Asian with Eastern tradition, there's deference. So we have our elders and we're always deferential to them. Even in Korean, you have 2 forms of the language. There's 존댓말 and 반말, which there's high speech and low common speech. So if I talk to a person same age or lower, then I use the common speech. Somebody who's older than me, even if they're like a week older than me, I use 존댓말, which is the high speech.
Is a speech is it kind of like speaking slang and proper, or is it really more like a whole nother set of
I think that's almost equivalent. But for example, if I were to say hi to you and we were peers, I could say 안녕, which is hi. But if you're my elder, I would say 안녕하세요.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so
it sounds like a similar.
Yeah. So there's almost a modified kind of ending to a lot of the language. So I say this as someone whose Korean speaking is rusty, but the language, even that language, shapes the way that we interact with one another. And there's a high culture of honor. So there's like a 홍익인간, which is a kind of a Korean principle in which we are bound to duty to serve the greater society. And parents will sometimes tell this to their Korean parents will sometimes tell this to their kids. They'll say, if you're not contributing and you're just consuming, if you're not a net worth in society, you might as well take your own life.
Dang.
So the good part of our Hongik Ingan, the duty to people, is we do think collectively. If we had that kind of thinking, everybody would be wearing masks, right? So that kind of honor bound to our family, to the collective, to the whole, that's important to us. And it also creates a strong work ethic. So I don't want to, diss completely my own culture. But in the same time, the shadow side of that, or the negative side of that, is people who feel like they're not useful, that have no utility or productivity, or they're not creating. This is especially ableist towards those who are disabled. Do they have no worth? And in that philosophy, at least, they would say yes. So I say all that to say, people pleasing stems out of me wanting to make sure that I'm doing my duty, that I'm honor bound to other people, that I'm pleasing everyone all the time. I'm not making a fuss. I'm not causing trouble. I'm not consuming or taking or pulling resources away, but I'm constantly pouring out to other people. Now, I think the root of people pleasing is that my fear of people abandoning me, my fear of loneliness, being alone, my fear of people not approving of what I'm doing, I so frantically want to please people to create this predictable group of people around me who love me and approve of me. I'm basically conforming or coercing people around me to like me so that I have this predictable world of safety. Now, it's good to have safety, of course. It's good to have people approve of us and love us and like us. But if I'm only acting in a way to get that from people, I'm in a constant manic and frantic marathon, like a sprint all the time. It's endless that I'm pouring out. And I didn't know I was doing that. And then when I got to chaplaincy, I realized I was a flake because I was overcommitting. I was saying yes to 5 different chaplains when they had emergencies. Sometimes if a visitor was, understandably acting out, I would take the visitor's side, even though other people, their safety was at risk, because I just wanted to look like a good guy, like a good chaplain. And then the nurses sometimes or other chaplains would get mad at me, like, hey, you sold out on me. And I was like, oh, I wanted to look like a good chaplain. It's like, yeah, but safety, we got to think of everybody's safety, not just you looking good. So I say that to my own shame. And I think there's a good part of people pleasing. We want to be able to please people, but not people please. We want to give life, but not give our life away.
Good. I like that a lot. And what people listening to this, everybody's obviously not a chaplain that listens, but everybody can relate to these voices, that people pleasing thing, giving your life away, because in the book, it all comes crumbling for you at some point. It can only go so far. You stay in survival mode, but you don't live when you are constantly just overdoing it with yourself. And you found that out pretty quickly. Thank goodness for somebody calling you out on it.
For sure. I'm glad for that.
And then as far as the internal voice, the last one is judgment. This is huge for people. Can you talk a little bit about the judgment piece?
Yeah. So when we judge somebody, there's an element of controlling. I would like you if you did things the way that I did them, or if you look more like me. Right. So there's sort of an imperialistic mindset that when we resent somebody for being who they are, we're almost saying either exist and move like I do, or you might as well not exist. And so we see that with racism. We see that with bigotry, prejudice, all of it. Right. There's almost this manifest destiny type of thinking where I'm going to convert this person into my way. It's a very puritanical type of thinking. And in the book, I give it a name, main character syndrome, which I don't think I came up with that name, but it basically says, I am the main character. All of you are secondary people around me. You're not as real as I am. I am the hero of the story. And you must either bend to my will, or you must be eliminated, or I must rescue you. And that's also similar to the Cartman drama triangle, the rescuer, the victim, and the abuser. And so what I learned early on, and I say this in the book, is that within the 8 months of being married, my wife and I were calling it quits. And I think, and she may admit this too, but I don't want to speak for her. I had that voice of condemnation over her. I think she had some for me too, but naturally we all do. Like, we would say conditional things like, well, if you just done this, there wouldn't be a problem, right? Why not this way? Why not just do it like I did? And then also we boost ourselves up like, well, when would this happen? And then we write a revisionist history. No, I just said it like this. This is what I meant, and that's not really how it went. But this voice of controlling others, where it starts is not necessarily hate for another person, but because we have this motive of, I want to do good for the universe and I need to save these people. And if they don't act the way I want them to act, they're going to go off the rails. And so there's a good motive. And so I actually had a much longer section. I had to cut some of it. But in that one part of the book, I talk about how almost every interview with a person who was part of a hate group and ended up leaving, they didn't get in because the leader said, hey, we're going to hate a bunch of people. I mean, maybe that happens to some groups, but largely those cults like Nexium, like Fred Phelps, Westboro Baptist Church, and like we're seeing now with Christian nationalism, a lot of those cults, they'll say like, hey, we're trying to save the world. We're trying to do something good for the universe. And so the motive is, I must become a rescuer. I must become the savior. And I'm sacrificing myself for these people to save them. But then that's when the main character syndrome pops in,
And they don't even hear. They say they're trying to save, but they don't really pay attention or hear, or they're not open to any other understanding other than what they have known.
That's exactly right. Like the baseline is my world that I grew up in.
Yeah.
And you're the abnormal. You are the alien. You are off. So you must meet my baseline. And so I learned early on, I was doing that to I say that to my own shame. I was doing that to my wife, where everything was conditional. If you just did this, there wouldn't be a problem. And I had to learn to fix that. And I really believe, I say this in the book too, that chaplaincy did save our marriage. Just that self-awareness of, this is what I was doing.
Yeah, because the fact that you got to that point, and it wasn't until they started priding and prodding that you started to realize like all of these voices and things that you were doing, because you were so on autopilot. And we typically are. We live on autopilot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go ahead. You good?
So those are the 4 internal voices, and this is just a snippet, but we get really, I listened to it on Audible. I was telling my husband, I was like, yeah, and he said this, but I listened to your voice, so I feel like you were talking to me. But so the 4 internal voices we just talked about: self-doubt, pride, people-pleasing, and judgment. And then there's the 4 external voices: trauma, guilt, grief, and family dynamics. Can you talk a little bit about those external voices that you bring up?
Yeah, sure thing. By the way, I think the reader of the book was J.C. Ramirez, who read the Audible book. He did it.
Okay.
It's funny because can I tell you a story about this? I auditioned for the book to be the narrator.
You have to audition for the book? Okay,
yeah,
there's a publisher.
There's weird things about the publishing world that they don't tell you about. And that was one of those things. I was so bummed out that I didn't get it. And I wrote a long email making my case. I was like, this book is about the voices we carry, and it's about finding your voice. And if I don't read it, then, isn't that antithetical to the purpose of the book? And then I was like, and then there, I was like, my dad's voice is in there. I don't want anybody to do like a form of yellow face. And then I was saying all this stuff like, please advocate for me to be able to read this book. And so I did a reading sample for them to audition. And it was what they call a blind audition. It's basically, they don't know that it's me. And so then they ended up picking somebody else. And I was really bummed out. But I ended up talking with the guy who narrated the book. He's fantastic. He's a wonderful person. I'm glad he read it. And I think there was something affirming about having a really good narrator read like your work. It's just something that hit different. Like I was like, oh my gosh. Like I don't know if I would have told it that as good as he did.
It was good. I like that he changed voices and everything. Yep. It was good.
And he was very respectful with it. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so the chapter about trauma, I put it together with guilt. And the connection that I make is when we have guilt, it's because I did something bad, and then shame is I am bad, right? Like my whole person is no good. And so guilt comes out of I did something to hurt somebody. I'm guilty about either injuring somebody or withholding from them. But then now I carried a lot of guilt in life because of things I did, like when I turned 14 and my parents' divorce, and then weekend getting into things I shouldn't have, and running from police and getting in fights and stuff. It's all a bad history. And I know I hurt people. But as I started doing chaplain training, they taught us on trauma, and they taught us the ACE score. And ACE score, for those who, I mean, I'm sure your audience knows already, but it's adverse childhood experiences, and it's on a scale of 10. And I know that, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who wrote The Deepest Well, she's changing the test around because, 10 questions, you can answer yes to just one instance, but what if this happened 100 times? Even if you score 1, if it happened 100 times, that's more than if you only score 9, or if you score 9, it would only happen once each. Anyway, she's changing around the test. Yes. And I'm a 9 out of 10. And I would say for being 9, I would say half of them happen multiple times. Right. Yeah. And by the way, if somebody's listening and wondering what the ACE score is, it's basically different questions like, did you ever see your parents strike each other? Did you grow up where a family member continually went to jail, et cetera, et cetera? So you have these questions that they ask you, and you get doses of trauma. And if you score a 4 or more, then you have this sudden exponential increase a higher chance of getting, for example, heart attacks, depression, even brittle bones, or promiscuity, acting out, more prone to violence, less impulse control, more brain fog, having cognitive difficulties. And so the connection that I make is, we may be guilty about things that we did in the past, but is it possible that the things that we did in the past are because we absorbed trauma into our bodies, which changed us? The trauma got trapped into our bones and then manifested as these destructive actions. And I walk this tightrope between, yes, we're absolutely accountable for the injuries that we cause other people. Absolutely, I believe that 100%. And at the same time, if that person had grown up in a different environment with resources, mental health, with health insurance, with better resources in the neighborhood and education and school, would they have acted out the way that they did? In my cases, I don't believe so. I think it's not just a matter of virtue, it's also a matter of systemic resources and systemic failures. Mm-hmm. And so people who go through trauma, they're more likely to act out. So even though they may have guilt about those things, that guilt is connected to things that they may not have been able to help. Mm-hmm. And so if I grew up in the same neighborhood that they did, with the same resources, same family, I may have acted like they did. Yeah. And somebody else may have acted like I did. So again, I don't want to take anybody off the hook and say, hey, it's all okay because trauma happened to you. At the same time, it was so liberating for me to know that something happened to me and something fractured. Trauma got trapped in my bones, and that voice of trauma would just sometimes break out. Yep. Almost at random moments. And I realized, like in my 20s, when I was getting in fights and stuff, like, why was I so angry? Was it because I'm a bad person? Maybe I made bad choices, but it's because of seeing my parents fight and argue all the time and growing in a turbulent household. It's because of a lot of those traumatic things that happen. It's because I grew up in relative poverty. Mm-hmm. And so I think if people knew that, they would at least know, this is why I am the way that I am right now. And if I know how to get through that, then certainly there's a way forward, rather than just saying, hey, it's all your fault, you're to blame. There's a path forward. And, the new study just came out, I believe that was in 2019, PACEs, PCE, positive childhood experiences. And there are 7 markers, 7 different things that a child can receive in order to actually be able to overcome adversity. And that's a new study that just came out. And I put some of those in there in the book. I managed to smuggle it in right before it went to press. I think those positive childhood experiences work for adults too. For example, one of them is, did you have 2 non-parent adults in your life who were able to watch over you, speak to you, and guide you? Like, did you have a relationship with 2 non-parent adults? And I think that's true for adults too, not just for kids. Mm-hmm. I think all of us need that kind of mentoring figure in our lives, somebody who's got our back, somebody who's kind of the halftime coach. Yeah. And so that connection that I make between trauma and guilt, are we responsible for everything that we've done wrong? Mm-hmm. We're responsible for the aftermath of it, but the origin of it came from forces, invisible forces we couldn't help. So at my workplace, this is a copyrighted statement that they use, but I'm gonna share it with you. We ask, instead of asking what is wrong with you, we ask what happened to you. And so if we see somebody acting out, lashing out, like what in your day went wrong, or what led to this moment, you know, what happened to you? And then we can begin to talk about that path forward. And that's always more effective.
Did you just post that? Because I felt like I heard you say that, or maybe I read it. Did you just post it on Instagram?
You know, I might have posted
Oh,
that
that's what it is. I think
somewhere. Yeah,
what happened to you. Yeah. And I think that's important. The part I just want to touch on what June is saying about trauma being held in your body. The body keeps the score. And
absolutely.
one of the like, I'm grateful that like this part of my purpose is working with people, helping them like understand what's happening and fault and responsibility. And I believe that so many things that have happened have not been our fault. But right now, as an adult, if I want to work on my healing, it's my responsibility. But it's
Yes,
hard to do that if I don't understand my story. And so many people have blocked out their story, or because a lot of the things that have happened weren't always tangible. It's not always like physical or sexual like abuse. Some of it is psychological and emotional neglect and trauma that affects our thoughts and our feelings, which affect the way that we behave, what we do. And I think if people that are listening to this, to really think about, your responsibility for getting to where you need to be is part of it. You got to acknowledge, what happened, and acknowledge that despite what happened, you're not this broken person. You're not doomed. I think some people
that's
just say,
right.
well, this is just how I am. And it's not, there's so many studies, and the book, The Body Keeps the Score, talks a lot about some of the mental illnesses and physical ailments that people have that are a direct link, where there's signs of the certain type of traumas being correlated to the type of illness they have. And I think in American culture, we manage symptoms. We don't get to the root of the problem a lot of
Wow.
the times.
Yeah.
We numb it, right?
Wow.
And I think that growing up in America, that's kind of the thing that we learn. We numb it with pills, we numb it with social media, we numb it with sex, with whatever it is. And so like we just keep in this cycle of pain. And so if
Yeah.
we work on, if we really want to heal, we got to start to feel, and that's hard.
Yeah.
That's really hard to do. But I feel like and one thing I tell people, when they work with me and they start to change, they didn't hit the lottery, they didn't win a new car. They just started to shift their thought process. There's peace on the other side of that pain that you have to feel to get through it, you know?
Yeah. Dang. You're speaking to me, right? This is why you get 6 fire emojis on your reviews. This is why, y'all. This is
But
right
that makes
here.
sense, right? It makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely makes sense. When you said manage symptoms,
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we do, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, to be fair, it's hard to confront our trauma. I mean, what I didn't
Right.
know about this until 6 years ago when I went into the chaplain program. And when I was talking about my childhood, I was laughing. I was laughing about my parents abusing me and stuff. And one of the chaplains, the supervisors, looked at me during the middle of our, group time, and she said, "You know what happened to you was not okay, right?"
Yeah.
And I think I put that in the book, but I don't think I put this part in the book where my reaction was. I was like, "No, no, it's fine. It's fine. It's what everybody grows up with, right?" And she was like, "What happened to you is not okay." And and slowly my smile faded, my face started to melt. I started to understand the gravity of what I was saying. And I was kind of half laughing, but I started weeping.
Mm-hmm.
And she kept saying, "What happened to you is not okay. What happened to you is not okay. We got to name that. We got to name that." And it's in naming that the recovery can begin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we start to find resilience, right?
And the reason why June was able to, say it's okay, I think a lot of the coping mechanisms we utilize as a child to escape or to say it was fine, has allowed us to get through those moments, but they don't work anymore as an adult. The way
Mm-mm.
we've been able to manage some of the trauma, as we get older and relationships have different interactions and engagements with people, escaping doesn't work anymore. So that's literally what happens when I'm listening to people's stories. That I can tell the people that utilize escaping mentally during that time. And another thing I wanted to say about, this idea of trauma is that if your leg was broken, you would do something about it. I think when it comes
Yeah.
to um, our physical body, it's easier to accept. And so I really want us to really start thinking about our mental in the same way we think about our physical. Just because we don't see it in real time doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Oh, the invisibility of the internal wound,
Mhm.
that's a big cultural problem. And I
Mhm.
see that in my own culture too, where if you're not bleeding, if you're not fainting, if you're not exhausted, if you don't have any physical signs, you're fine,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But mental health, all of that, I think there's a kind of bootstraps sort of thinking where it's like, if it's inside, just try real hard and just change it, and you can do it real, and there's sort of like almost a flippancy or an easiness with which we say that.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, if it's physical, okay, we got to do something about it. If it's internal, it's invisible, so it's less likely to be seen. But it's those invisible wounds that we carry.
Yep. Yep.
Those can become harder than the physical ones,
Mhm.
because they take actual work. Our physical wounds, not all of them, but for the most part, our body has these automatic mechanisms, the white blood cells and the platelets and all of that. It'll come together and heal. And yes, we need external help, but they can see that. But that internal work,
Mhm.
that takes a cooperation, that takes a self-awareness, that takes an internal confrontation to dig all that up and to begin that healing.
Yep. Yep. This is good. For people that are listening, this book is called The Voices We Carry. It's available everywhere, Audible, or you can read it. I just found out that I can download books on my phone. I thought you had to get an actual Kindle. So that's exciting. So that's where you can find the book and also
Yep.
find him on Instagram. Um, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let that be the ending. I just realized this. I'm gonna let that be the ending of the episode. Then I want the violence in the Asian American community to be its own episode.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
is that okay? We switch gears.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
No problem at all.
So one of the things that I've noticed that's been happening on the news is there's been a lot of violence um, against the Asian American community. Now, as far as when it started, because that part I'm not really understanding on was it already happening, or how did the uptake take place from your perspective? Tell me what you've been seeing and thinking about.
Yeah. So as far as I can tell from what I'm reading, it seems like these almost random, though they're not random, but this escalation of assaults that are happening seemingly randomly, uh, it went, there was a spike very suddenly around March at the start of the pandemic.
Hmm.
And we're talking about in the States, in the US, also in Canada. And in fact, we've seen it all around the world. And a lot of that can be attributed to this narrative that COVID was blamed on China.
Uh-huh.
And when people hear China, they think all Asians as well, unfortunately.
Hmm.
And so by reports that I've seen, hate crimes have gone up as much as 1,900 or 2,000% against the Asian American community. And I think that is happening in major cities like San Francisco and New York. And certainly if they're not all reported, and so they're underreported. And so it's happening everywhere. But there was this narrative that occurred that somehow either the Chinese are to blame, or they made the virus, or they were covering it up, and therefore that's why we have it now. If they would have just told us earlier, even though from my understanding, the first instances were in November and the US knew about it in January, but then at the time, that presidential administration did not want to do anything about it for a long time.
Hmm.
Anyway, I say all that to say, our public discourse and narrative shapes what we believe about people, what we believe about one another, and how we ought to treat each other. And I know I've seen all the arguments that oh no, it didn't affect that, or the hate crimes are always going since before that happened. And then there were even people arguing, well, what defines a hate crime? Do they have to yell a slur while they're doing and all those kinds of things? So are they just now counting those because they want to create higher numbers? But what I know, what I've personally experienced and have seen in the Asian American community is a subtle and, well, not always subtle, but I've seen an underlying rage against the Asian American community because we had a president who, however people feel about him, he kept saying China virus and wouldn't stop. So you have this underlying rage, low-key rage, and then you have the overt rage of people. There's a flash or a split second maybe when they see this Asian person walking, and they may remember that narrative. It just pops up. China virus, this person, this is why we're in this pandemic. This is why I have to wear a mask. This is why I can't go out. And then they'll go and push that person or worse. And there have been elderly people in these big cities who have died, these elderly Asian Americans who have died from such violence. And so I don't want to attribute all of it to COVID because I think the racist attitude towards Asian Americans and Asians in general has been a thing that has been ongoing for a long time and not talked about enough. And I have to say, objectively, I know that what Asians experience, I do have privilege as an Asian male. So what we experience objectively is certainly not on the scale of what other people of color are experiencing. And at the same time, the attention that is brought to the plight of Asian Americans and the racism against them, it doesn't get nearly the proportional attention that I think it should. And I want to say this delicately because I remember saying this to a diversity council room once, saying like, how come there's not enough attention on Asian Americans and what we're going through? And then somebody countered very gently and said, the Black community, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated about 60 years ago, 70 years ago, and we're just now seeing change. Change takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of sweat, a lot of blood, a lot of tears. And so for me to expect for us to catch up to, Asian Americans must be treated equally, it's going to take a lot of sweat, blood, and tears. And I don't want to compare my effort to somebody else. So when I see that rhetoric, like, hey, what about us? What about us? I'm like, we got to put in the work, and we got to put in the work together, all these different communities. And we're putting down the work on top of work that has already been laid down. We ought to be thankful for that. And I also want to say there's another layer on top of that. I'll just take 10 seconds on this, but I believe it's James Baldwin who said, sometimes it's too long to wait on time. So there are things that need to happen right now. The violence does need to stop. We do need to bring awareness to this. It needs to be talked about in the media more. And so the sadness I see is not just the hate crime in itself, but the silence around it, that there's very little movement, that there's very little media coverage. It's growing, and we know we have work to do. But my plea is see us, hear us, see us and hear us. And I hope that blame around, we need to change our stories, right? We need to change that narrative, wherever that virus might have come out of. Why are we attaching it to a certain group of people? And I feel like that story is just being used in order for people to manifest the hatred they already had.
Yeah.
Right.
And people are, when people are struggling, they're willing to believe any narrative that comes out. Somebody like the last presidential administration, so many narratives that was just said with no backing. Biden didn't win, and people were ready to believe it. One of the things that you said is around, the Asian community. People have experienced things in the past, and he has a really good Instagram where June speaks a lot about different things. But he says, these last few weeks, I've been reading about the many assaults against Asian Americans, and I was hit with a lightning bolt of a memory I had nearly forgotten. It is my very first memory. I was 4 on my first day of preschool, the only Asian in class. I didn't speak English. When the teacher found out, she forced me to sit in the corner. She told me not to talk or turn around. I wept the entire day.
Yeah.
My mother, when she picked me up, cussed out the teacher and switched me to another school. But it was too late. A year or two later, as I learned English, I lost much of my Korean. The trauma destroyed my native language. My tongue had been burnt of its millennia of heritage in my still forming mouth. This day, I can still understand Korean just enough, but when I try to speak, I get tongue tied, a block. It is apparent why. My voice was strangled. A teacher failed her non compliant student, and that's in quotations, non compliant. A system allowed racist violence against a child. A teacher did not understand she had a non English speaking American in her class, and instead of including him with even the smallest gesture, simply cut him off in a corner. The teacher was a cog in a system not funded with resources to equip their educators. That child never had a chance. Um, so he goes on to, talk. He gives a really good, account of what happened. And so, what do you think? Because I feel like when it comes to Asian Americans, I think you Asian Americans face it from all angles. Face, you know what I mean? Like, I think people tend to feel like they don't know where to place you, and people that are even American in here, they I think that they're treated differently. What do you think needs to happen, or how can people be more educated around this? Because that should not have happened. You said you were 4, right? Were you 4? Let me just read that
Yeah,
again. You were
I was
4.
4.
Like
Yeah.
how, and that was an adult. Like that was an adult that treated you that way. So, what do you think needs to happen, or how can we work through this?
Hmm. Well, earlier I mentioned changing the story, changing the narrative. And I think what I've seen in particular with the Asian American community, and I'm speaking for, I believe, second generation Asians, any Asian really living in America, is that the prominent story is that Asian culture, Asian people are exotic decoration, or the foreigner enemy element. They're the invader, they're the spy.
Mhm.
We are secondary characters, and we're probably one of the last acceptable punchlines in popular culture. And so if you remember that one year when they were talking about Oscars so white, I think that was the hashtag. And they were talking about how the Academy Awards, most of the nominees, in fact, I think almost all the nominees were white Americans. So they had this hashtag Oscars so white because people were upset that there was no diversity in the Oscars that year.
Yes, I remember. Okay.
Yeah. And during that awards thing, they have skits during these Academy Awards. They made an Asian math joke. They even had like kids come out, Asian kids, and they had props, and it was a whole skit. And I just thought, isn't that strange that they're pushing for diversity, and yet they had this Asian joke, this punchline joke?
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Reinforcing that narrative about, by the way, I'm not any good at math, but I mean, for real, I don't know where that, okay. Anyway, that's a whole other thing but they're reinforcing that narrative. And so I often feel like, and I think, I hate to speak for all of us because I'm not a representation of all of us. I hate to be a monolith, yet I often feel like I am not as real as other people. And there are times when I have, say again. Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
You don't feel like you're as real as other people?
I don't feel like I'm as real as other people.
Sorry, hold on.
Yeah. I don't feel like I'm as real as other people, as in I am just a background figure. I don't really have hopes and dreams and fears and anxieties like everybody else. I don't have a thought life, an interior life. I'm just always going to be decoration. And even when people include me into their diversity councils and forums and panels and tables, I am just a decoration for the moment, so that table can look like they're diversified, but I'm never really going to be truly part of them. And there will always be that invisible glass wall. Damn. And again, objectively, I know that there are other types of racist violence that are much more severe. I think for me, it's a very, very oppressive background noise. It's almost like the temperature or the weather around me is very different. It's just this constant pushing out almost of, you're not part of us. One time I went to a wedding and tried to talk to some people around me, and I was the only Asian there. It was mostly, I hate to knock on them, but it was mostly white people. I was the only Asian there. I officiated this ceremony, and I sat down at my table and tried to talk with people, and it was almost as if I was a ghost. Nobody responded to me. This happened for about 10 minutes. I thought I was going crazy. I was literally leaning over the table like, hey, how are you? And hey, you know, I was trying to talk with people, engaging with them. Nobody's talking to me. I ran outside. I called my wife. And the first question I asked her, I was in a panic mode. I was breathing hard. I thought I was going to have a panic attack. And I asked my wife, do I exist?
Damn.
And she knew what had happened. You know, she's got that discernment. And she just said, you know, you do, babe, you do. And she knew what had happened, that I was at this wedding and people had put me in second class status, you know, not even second class, third class. And is it because I was the pastor there doing the wedding? I don't know, maybe. But I got a strong sense of, you are not real. You are over there. You don't look like us, you know? And there's all these little types of aggressions that happen. Cashiers talking very slow to me. People, when I make a driving mistake, there's an extra rage at me, like, oh, an Asian driver, of course. There's a little extra layer of rage. When I go to the grocery store, I know we're all trying to keep social distance, but if I accidentally cough or clear my throat, it's almost like there's an extra, people jump up because they're like, oh, this Chinese guy's probably got coronavirus. They carry it, right? So I'm feeling these things. And sometimes I'm like, is this in my head? Is it, am I just making this up? And I feel like sometimes I'm like gaslighting myself, like, no, that can't be real. It's just in my head. But when I look at it as a whole, it's just all throughout the day, hundreds of times a week, it builds up, and it's like a daily dying. And so a lot of times I do feel invisible and not seen. Even as I'm saying this, my hands are sweating, you know?
Yeah.
And to answer your question, Celeste, that you said in the beginning, we got to change the story. And that means, how do we speak about, interact with, make art for, make room for Asian voices and people that are fully humanized, that have a thought life, that have an interior life, where their culture is not just taken for food and decoration, but that people also engage with, participate in, and know the suffering that we experienced. I wrote the other day on my Facebook, if you're going to sit with me and eat my food, also sit with me in my tears and my suffering. You know, and that can go for lots of people of color, that people want to imbibe in the culture, but not in the chronological story of their suffering. Like, right. Yep, I'll take your dress, but your tears, I don't want that. You know, let me just do the easy mode. So what I see, I actually made a list of this. I'm going to post it sometime on social media, but I started making a list of every instance in a movie, and I'm talking modern movies, not like 80s necessarily, where Asians were just used as a joke or a punchline or a prop, or some character who was like a support character. Like, I'm the guy in the chair, I'm the guy doing the computer tech stuff. Or so, and if you start building all this up, you start seeing how easily Asians have been demonized and sort of put into one glob. It's just one type of person, and they're all the same and think the same, and they're this collective. So I know it's on me to speak up, but I also know it's on other people to be able to listen and to hear. How can we change that story? And the story is so important because those narratives do shape how we see and treat other people.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And you're right. It is the last running joke that's acceptable. That society accepts, right? Around the different things that come up, and people don't really speak up on it. So one of the things that we can do for people that are listening to this is, speak up when you hear that, right? I think that most people may not think much of it. Maybe, as we talked about in last episode, with the voices we carry, because it's another episode. As we talked about in last episode, and the voices we carry, part of the narrative. Dang, I just lost my train of thought. I said speaking up, and part of.
You're talking about the last episode. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just lost my train of thought just now.
That's okay. Happens to me all the time. I walk into rooms and I'm like, why am I here again?
Dang, it was so good too. But so
it's going to come back in the middle of a sentence, right?
I know it is. So
yeah.
You said that we can actually start to, we can start to speak up. That's
Mhm.
important. And then I forgot what I was going to say. Shoot.
It's going to come back. Celeste, can I tell you a real quick story?
Yeah.
I was at this grocery store, and I tell a grocery store story in the book. But one time, this cashier, I'll just be real polite and say she wasn't Asian.
Mm-hmm.
You can guess. But she asked me out of the blue, I was checking out my groceries, and she said, hey, you know how to make fried rice?
What?
And I just, the people pleasing part of me just wanted to answer her, And then this wonderful Black woman,
Oh, yes. I
this
remember the
this
story. Go ahead.
bag lady behind her. I think I wrote it online somewhere, but
You
this
told it in the
bag
book
lady,
too.
is it in the book? Yeah.
Yeah.
This lady behind her, I think she said, girl, are you out of your mind? just this wonderful Black woman said that. And so what that did for me was, for one, I don't think this lady had a clue that what she was asking was offensive,
Nope.
right? That she just pulled on that. And then the lady behind her, she saw something wrong and she spoke up, and she gave this lady pause. And I know in the grand scheme of things, is that systemic change? Maybe not necessarily. Is that changing laws? Maybe not necessarily. But for that person that day, she changed the story. She rewrote the story and got this. And for a second, she got to see me as a whole person, not just somebody that could possibly make fried rice. So I'm so glad that this wonderful Black woman spoke up and just spoke that life into existence. And I got to tell you, Celeste, I do make a good fried rice. But I gotta say it. Let me say it first. Don't ask me that. Let me say it. And then when we get to know each other, then I'll tell you. And that's why I was so mad, because I was like, look, I do make it, but I don't want to tell you that. Why did you have to ask? Let me tell you first.
And that was good. Yes, you told that in the story because you felt seen. And I don't think people. I'm grateful for your transparency, as you always are, because I don't think people understand this part of what takes place. Oh, I know what I was going to say.
Oh.
So it's so good. Sorry. So as we were talking about in the last episode, your culture does a lot of people pleasing and doing for others. And so maybe part of why people don't know or don't see what's taking place is because there's no response. Like typically when something happens, it's just you chalk it up and you don't really respond. Like the lady in the grocery store had to respond. It's not something you would have typically spoke up. Maybe now you would, now that you've done a lot of work, but back then, part of your culture, do you think part of the culture kind of stops people from speaking up about how they're feeling about something or not being seen because they're only thinking about themselves as it relates to the greater good of others?
Yeah. I would hate to monolithically describe all people, because, just as, I mean, just as we all have different personalities, the same is true for people within their culture. Some fight against it, some fall into it. I know for me, both culturally and because of the trauma that I received, there was a lot of people pleasing. But absolutely, the basis of of my culture is very much to be deferential, to be okay with things. I'll tell you, this is a really, really heavy, sad story. So sort of a trigger warning. But in South Korea, this happened maybe, I want to say 3-4 years ago, probably more. Have you heard of the South Korean ferry incident? It was, there was a boat that was carrying people, like a ferry, from one side to the other across this river, and it started to sink. And I believe that it was the captain of the boat who kept saying, everyone stay calm, everyone stay calm. And so nobody moved, even though somebody could have grabbed their life, the vest, and they got on the boat and left. And the boat kept sinking. Nobody moved, nobody moved. Almost every single person, I think, except 2 people, died on that ferry.
Dang.
I think like 100 something people. This is all South Koreans. And then the captain felt so bad, so guilty, that he ended up taking his own life later. And so when you have a culture that the leader told us to stay calm, I'm not going to move, even at the threat of my own life. I mean, that's a dark story, right? But that is essentially the end result of that entire mindset. That's the shadow side of it. That's the hard side of it. And so there's a cultural element to that for sure. Can I tell you another real quick story, Celeste? So I got this theory. You remember when Hurricane Katrina happened and people were looting the stores and stuff, and everybody was saying, look at these Americans doing that. And then in Japan, when the tsunami happened, nobody was looting. Everybody was cooperating, getting along together. But here's what people don't know, Celeste, is that in Japan, when the tsunami the real reason why people didn't loot those stores is, one, nobody wants to look bad. They don't want to be caught on camera looting because, hey, we're doing for the greater good. Japanese culture is built on Shintoism, which is we are the divine race and we have to be perfect. That's why Japanese technology is like nuts. But, and I'm generalizing, but there's also this other thing where the stores were largely protected by Japanese gangsters, the Yakuza. And so there was a racket happening. So it's like, if I steal from these people, they're going to beat me up. And so you have these stores that these stores that were actually hiring gangsters to protect them. So there's a conformity there. There's a conformity, right? Like, I better conform and act right or they're going to beat me up. That behavior was enforced. So we may look at Americans and say, hey, look at them looting the stores and stuff like that. That's survival. And then we can look at Japan and say, oh my gosh, they were, acting so right. But why were they acting right? Was their motive really real to act right? Or was it because they were afraid to act wrong? Who's better in this situation? Better not to loot, but also they weren't looting because they were afraid of getting beat up. They're also afraid of looking bad. And so you see kind of the shadow side of that culture. Maybe people pleasing looks good in some instances, but if you chase it all the way down, right, you start to see the secret motives of people's hearts. So that has always fascinated me culturally, seeing the difference in that yes, we look like a polite and respectable culture, but the shadow side of that is that we don't speak up as much as we ought to. Sometimes we're passive. We don't want to protest as much as we ought to. One, because sometimes it doesn't do anything, unfortunately, because we're not heard. But two, when I try to get the Asian, this is for me, but I've seen this at large, when I try to get the Asian American community to get together, at large, the response is, oh, you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to make a fuss. We just got to stay low key and work hard and don't try to, bring attention to yourself. We're all just like this. But if violent crimes are happening against us, if there's racism against us, we hope people will speak up for us, but we also got to speak up for ourselves too.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think that, everything that you've shared has definitely enlightened people around how they can help. And then for people, my Asian American audience who's listening, I really hope that this helps you feel seen and, work on how did you work on feeling seen overall? Because I feel like you're not where you were before. Just for my people that are listening, that because I did not understand it that deeply until today. So my heart goes out to people that are in this in this world feeling that way. So for people that may feel that way, what would you say to them? Like, how can they work on feeling seen despite what has happened?
That's a good question. I would say for sure there's got to be sort of an internal work that is done about being seen, because there's so many levels of trauma with my parents, also just with the social trauma that happened, that kind of dying from 1,000 cuts. And there had to be work where I understood eventually that my worth is not contingent on the way that people treated me.
Yes.
Right? My value is not tethered to the ways that people manifested their own violence and hatred and trauma.
Yep.
It can't be. That my worth is permanent. I bear the image of God. There is grace that is imprinted on me. And it takes a lot of work to believe that, and it's still a daily choice to make. And so there's that internal work. There's also the community work, where I found a community where we affirmed one another. And I'm not saying we just high-fived each other all day and we're fake happy about things, because there's that feedback part, right? But there's a community where we said, you went through that same thing? I also went through that same thing, and then we talk about it and we go through it, and we kind of are sitting in the river together of all the things that we went through, sitting in the river of that history. And so there's that community work. I did a lot of work with my therapist. I have a therapist who's Asian American, and I've been seeing her now, I believe, since September, and we've done everything virtually. And just the incredible amount of work that we've done, not just therapeutically, but because she's Asian American, we have this instant shared vocabulary and connection.
Yeah.
And she knows the heritage baggage that I have.
Yeah.
And she knows the heritage strengths that I have.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to be with community, to know here is where all the pitfalls were and the potholes were, but here's also the power and potential of that.
Yes.
Right. And so I had to find within my community affirmations. I would say that I found it. There's internal work that needs to be done. There's work that we need to done with community face to face. And I would say also it's my own faith really that helped me to understand I have this permanent value and worth that is not contingent on the way I've been mistreated.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But there is a God who loves me and sees me and hears me and who forgives me for the times that I didn't speak up and who empowers me to continue to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm preaching right now. Am I preaching?
All right, it's cool though. I like it. But that's the word for people, regardless of if you're Asian American or not.
That's exactly. Yep.
That was so on point. And I truly believe we were not meant to do life alone. And I think, with the pandemic and even, before the pandemic, a lot of people have isolated. And that them faulty thoughts comes screaming at you, and starts to feel real. There's something powerful about community that just kind of breaks it up a little bit, So I love your words of encouragement for people that might need to hear that today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Celeste.
This was amazing. We did 2 episodes. That was I thought about it in the middle. I'm like, oh, this book is so good, because I originally reached out to him about the book, but then I knew you were okay. You wanted to talk about the violence, and I wanted to do it. So I'm like, oh, let me just break it up into 2 episodes. So now we got 2 episodes.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I appreciate you so much for making time to come on. If people want to get the book, you can find it everywhere. And then if people wanted to follow you, they can follow you on.
Oh, Instagram, J.S Park 3000. I'm on Facebook, J.S Park. I'm on Twitter, J.S Park. And if y'all want to follow Celeste, leave a review on her podcast. 5 stars, no less. Bunch of fire emojis, all of them, all the emojis.
So I hope you do the same. I'm going to be looking out for your review, J.S Park.
I will do the same. I promise. I will do the same.
You've been out here screaming and telling people to do it for me. So
I know, yeah, no, I better now. Now I'm beholden. I'm going to do it for sure. I'm honor bound. I got to do it.
You are amazing. I appreciate everything that you do. I appreciate your transparency. I think that, we don't have to, it's not like people have to share their story, but I think, what me and you do, we offer people hope to know they're not alone. So that's good. I know the baby's crying.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry about that.
No,
it's my baby daughter. Yep.
No, we're done. We're good. I appreciate you though, and I appreciate everything that you do. You're helping so many people in so many different ways. So thank you for everything.
Yeah, Celeste, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Grateful for everything that you do and who you are.
And it wasn't hard live, right? I did okay with you. I did okay by you.
It was fantastic. I sometimes feel like I go on too long, and then I'm like, oh, I better roll it back.
No, you're good. I know how to guide it. I'm good. I do this for a living. Come on,
you
June,
do.
I got this.
You do, and you're on 293. You're a pro at this. You're a pro.
I'm a pro.
Yeah, they say it takes 100 times, and then after that, you're a pro.
That's it.
Yep.
Thank you, June. I hope you have a good night.
All right, you too. Thank you, Celeste.
Bye. That was awesome. That was June, J.S Park. You can find him on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. He's very transparent. And I love the fact that he shares so much of what he does, because I think that most times people think they're alone in the struggle, and we're not alone. And I really don't believe we're supposed to do life alone. which is why I started this podcast, because there's so many people like him that are doing things to empower people. And I just really want to kind of push that information out for people that might find themselves struggling. So thank you all so much for listening. I appreciate you all. We'll be back tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to talk to somebody else that's doing something to empower the lives of others. You can find more information about me by going to celestetherapist.com, and I'll talk to you later.
Smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity, and make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with